Welcome to another episode of the Spinoza Triad, the occasional philosophy discussions conducted by myself, John Gibbs, Dr. Richard Miller and Dan Rowland, as we discuss this week, or in this episode, Plato's Gorgias and the power of persuasion.
Can you outline it, John?
I can do it. Yeah, I can do an outline.
Brief one. Characters and outline.
So we've been reading, looking at, thinking about a dialogue of Plato. And of course, as we were saying just before we started recording, that all these dialogues, all of them in a way, one of the questions about them is, why are they dialogues? Why aren't they just simply essays? Why aren't they a piece of philosophical writing of the kind we'd be familiar with if we were reading Hegel or something? And the reason they're dialogues is probably because they were used as teaching tools. They're an example of the Socratic method, which Plato has acquired in a sense, is wanting to teach. That's the principal method of inquiry for Plato, is the dialogue, and he's got that from his master, as it were, Socrates. So Plato is around in 428. He's born in 428. He's travelled all around the Mediterranean, and in his 30s or so, having had a rather unpleasant experience in Syracuse, gets locked up by the dictator of Syracuse. He gets back to Athens and he sets up his school. And that school is going to be a school there for the next 800 years. I mean, it's older than Oxford University. Anyway, so Plato, as the founder of the school, and he dies in 348. So in his 30s and so on, he starts writing dialogues, and this is an early one. So so at the time he's writing this, Athens is now a democracy again. It's lost the Peloponnesian War, and he's looking back at the death of Socrates and takes Socrates, his avatar, his kind of imaginary teacher, who he'd only been a very young man when he'd been one of the acolytes of Socrates, and he was
a student, wasn't he, of Socrates?
He was a student along with other young men around Socrates.
Yeah,
one of the accusations was that Socrates had been corrupting the young. And Plato's been on a big sort of, travel around the Mediterranean and has come back to now devote he's come from a wealthy family. He doesn't have to work, like all of these philosophers. And he comes back to Athens to devote his life to philosophy. And so this is quite an early one. And so people say of it, the tone of it is quite angry, because in a sense, he's taking on the kind of people and contrasting the way of thinking of Socrates with people like Gorgias. And Gorgias, quick word about Gorgias. Gorgias is a star. He's a real guy. A couple of his bits of writing have survived. The writing that survived from Gorgias are examples of his demonstration rhetoric. And he's a star rhetorician. He also travels around the Mediterranean, being paid gargantuan sums of money by rich families to teach their sons to be orators. And oratory is the key to success in the Athenian and later the Roman world, because you're going to use it in law and you're going to use it in politics. And of course, today we're going to use it in so much more, but it's still relevant in that sense. So Gorgias is the man you go to teach you the art of rhetoric.
Which is persuasion, isn't it? Which is persuasion.
Well, yeah, that's interesting because you say that, Dan, because
it's going to be the basis of our discussion.
You're getting into the dialogue now, because that's the very first starting point. So you imagine them, they're supposed to be outside the house, outside in the street. They're invited to the house of a friend where Gorgias and a couple of his students and Socrates, is asked, would you like to meet him? And he says, well, I'll do that as long as he won't go into one of his big speeches. And the first thing he says to Gorgias is, I don't want big, long rhetorical speeches. Are you okay with short answers? And Gorgias says, yes, I can, I'm giving him this sort of voice. Oh, yes, I can do short or long, whatever you want. Whatever you want, Socrates. Well, there's a story that comes from another source about Gorgias that if you went to the Oracle at Delphi, if you've been in the old days, gone to the Oracle at Delphi in its height, you'd have seen all around it statues donated by people who'd gone there, received good advice, or gone there and wanted to propitiate the spirits of the Delphi. And statues, rich people donated stuff, a bit like donating things to a church. And Gorgias apparently donated a gold statue of himself. So this was a man not lacking in a sense of his own greatness, and he is enormously wealthy from his trade. So the first thing he says, well, I'll do anything, big or small. I don't mind. I can answer any question. Great, says Socrates. What are you? What is it you do? And that's the opening frame, because he pursues him on this argument, in this question. What is a rhetorician? He says, well, a rhetorician is the finest art of all. And he says, that's not an answer. You're just telling me how great you are. What is it you do? And finally gets him to that, Dan. You just said it. Finally gets him to admit, to define, because that's the Socratic method, isn't it? Getting towards a definition. And he says, being a rhetorician is the art of persuasion. And then he says it's the greatest of all arts, because if you can persuade someone to do something they don't want to do, or if you can persuade someone even over the head of the expert, then you are the greatest of all the philosophers. You're better than a scientist, better than a doctor, better than an architect, because you can persuade people to build buildings and they'll listen to you rather than the architect. You can persuade people to take medicine or not have the vaccine, or have the vaccine. You can see where I'm going with this. If you are persuasive, in other words, the expert is always second best to the art of persuasion, because the art of persuasion is a power, basically. What he's really saying is that the art of persuasion is a power that trumps all other powers.
You said the word. So it's exercise. So exercise of your will is what is good for you. Is that what he's arguing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then
exercising of your will to get things done.
Well, the real theme of all these dialogues is virtue, how to lead the good life. So where Socrates goes with this, or Plato goes with this, is he asks Gorgias, okay, I get that, it's a power, but how can you ensure that you do good with that power? So the first idea he gives him, he says, is if you can persuade people to do bad, should you? Do you teach your students that? And then we can link that to any kind of power. What is the responsibility of the gun manufacturer to the user of the gun? What is the responsibility of any politician or any persuader, whether they be, because in our age, the persuaders are the advertisers. We have the art of rhetoric for us today is magnified through the medium of the internet, is magnified through the medium of the artistry, as it were, of advertising and of persuasive techniques, of propaganda. It's really only you get into the 19th and 20th century that we realize just how, Gorgias is standing in front of people and using rhetorical flourishes. He's using structured arguments. He's using a way of getting you to agree with something, then leading that to so you agree with something you didn't think of in the first place. He's using verbal tricks,
make you think it's all in your own interest as well.
Oh, completely, yes. So in the end, the audience are convinced. But we today we're using Edward Bernays, the founder of modern advertising, or Vance Packard, the hidden persuaders. We're using methods of persuasion that are really, our rhetoric is a visual rhetoric, a media rhetoric.
I think it's deeper, John, than that, though. I wonder if in a modern thing, perhaps if we've talked before with alphas, it's controlling ideology, isn't it? At a deeper level now. On the one hand, it is advertising, but I think advertising persuades you to buy things, but there's a framework in which those ideas are held, and the rights and wrongs of anything are kind of within it's an ideological frame. I wonder if, just thinking there about you're saying about control and persuasion, that perhaps runs deeper now within a society than just advertising.
Well, that's interesting. Well, that is interesting, isn't it? Because if you identify then if Socrates were here, he'd say, what is this ideology, and how can we ensure that those producers of that ideology, whoever they might be, are in pursuit of good? So that's what he proposes to Gorgias. He says, how can you be sure your students will use this, as you admit it, awesome power to do good? Well, what in a sense today would say, right, okay, I'm not going to let Elon Musk use Twitter the way he wants to use it, because we're going to edit it, because we're going to impose restrictions on it, because we're going to regulate it.
Well, the framework for the debates themselves of what can be said and what can't be said. Because I looked at this dialogue and I just thought that it seemed like the sort of the modern kind of education system was kind of like that. It sets out, it's. I mean, I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's controlling rhetoric. It's controlling what can be said and what can't be said, and underlying that when you stand back and say, actually, ethically, how many times in a student's life when they can go through an education system are they asked, what does it mean to lead a good life? And that question isn't asked once the entire way through someone's education. And what you've got is an academized economic machine, if you like, which churns out data and the ethics of it are removed, I think, in many respects.
And everyone thinks that their life is just about themselves, and it doesn't offer any challenge to the individual to restrict themselves or to give service or duty, which is what perhaps Plato, through Socrates, is trying to point towards in these dialogues.
Well, you're absolutely right. Because I bet, Dan, when you go into schools or you talk to teachers or we talk to other educators, I bet many of them would deny that they don't do what Rich says they don't do. In other words, the school would be covered in slogans along, live about truth.
That's all it is, isn't it?
About be honest to yourself and so on. And they would say, well, we absolutely want to bring up moral, good people. And yet the system itself, in a sense, provides you with the kind of, what are exams for? Exams are so that you can access corridors of power or you can get jobs or whatever. There was an instrumentalism about education. That is the reality.
Well, the very fact it's measured in the way it is, hierarchically. It's so difficult when you're in it to see it. But when you step back and look at it like this, the outcome is defined by a number, and it hierarchically positions you. And if you follow that, I mean, he says in there, doesn't it, that the best people should run a society. There's no problem with that. And Socrates' response is that, you should be able to run yourself first. You need to be able to. The first place to start is introspectively on how, what are you doing, what's the best you can be, and how to best live your life. It's in contradiction really with his view.
And you could broaden that out about a lot of our society, the world we live in. How many? Rich, you asked that question.
Yeah.
How often do we ask, what is the good life? How should we be living virtuously? And it would say, well, it's almost as if that question can't be asked. Everything about our society is a kind of momentum towards some kind of, what exactly? It's as if the virtue exists today purely in the production of momentum, of stuff. What is the virtuous life?
That question seems rather old-fashioned now and rather quaint. Most people would say, what do you mean? What's right and wrong? It's just clear. Most people would say it's just very clear what's right and wrong. Don't cause harm.
Yeah, well, that's what Capitalist is going to argue, isn't it?
I think what Socrates through Plato is trying to do is it's more complicated than that.
Yeah,
as you said, Rich, it's about self-regulation and knowing yourself and being able to accept terms of reference so that you can have discussions with people that you disagree with. And I think a lot of this discussion is that how do you maintain a virtuous situation or discussion when someone doesn't accept your terms of reference? Like, for example, we don't want to go there, like the Trump or, the extremes to the far right or even on the far left. How do you deal with the person you disagree with in a civilized way? And I think that's what a lot of the dialogue is about, maintaining virtue.
No, I was going to say the cultural kind of logic of that, what you're explaining there, Dan, is that we've because of the lack of, I want to say, Socratic or introspection in ideas, you've ended up in a situation where the debate now isn't hinged upon the best idea; it's hinged upon which idea should be cancelled and got rid of. So you've got, it's the battle for. It's not the battle of ideas; it's a battle of cancelling. That something might be.
Yeah, sorry, John, we've gone off the tangent.
We are, but it's all right, because I think when in essence, you're absolutely right. When the first part of this dialogue, there are three parts to this dialogue. Only one of them, the smaller part, actually is a discussion between Socrates and Gorgias. The second part is as one of his students steps in. Gorgias is in trouble here. Our master is in trouble, and Polus steps in to sort of help him out. And the reason Gorgias has got in trouble is because Gorgias has been asked by Socrates, how can you ensure that your students use their power to good? And Gorgias says, well, I teach them to do. Well, now, first he uses two arguments. He says, well, it's not up to me how they use it. The gun manufacturer simply hands out the guns and says, but he doesn't like that. Gorgias doesn't want to admit that. So he says, well, of course, so Socrates says, can you teach them to be good then? And since he thinks he can teach anyone anything, he says, of course I can. And so I do. Yes, obviously. All of my students, I teach them to be moral and I teach them to have the power to persuade people. And he's caught himself in a dilemma because that means he is responsible for how they do. Now, Polus jumps in and he says to Socrates, go on then. What is a virtuous life? And that's where we're going in our discussion. And that's why I'm less worried in a sense. When I hear people talking about cancelling, I may disagree with it or worries about how we use language, like we were talking about before we started recording. But I think at least those are discussions about virtue. They are discussions in a sense about offence and discussions about hurting people's feelings and discussions about what you should and shouldn't say. In other words, whatever we think about our current discussion along cancelling or rewriting history, looking back at history, for instance, in a kind of critical way, critical race theory in America, whatever, it is a moral discussion. And so, if you fall into conversation with someone who says, well, I don't think you should say this, or that thing shouldn't be said, they are proposing a debate. At least I hope so. I know that sometimes it doesn't sound like a debate. But it is about virtue, isn't it? It's about how you.
It is, but the key word there is debate, isn't it? A debate needs two sides of which you thrash out, and hopefully, if you're both approaching it, irrationally, the best idea wins out. And I think that the difference is perhaps with a council culture nowadays that you're limiting that discussion, and it's not the best idea wins out, or it's just that there should be a blanket ban on saying anything.
Yeah, you've got to put this right at the heart of it. You've got to be able to refute and be willing to be refuted. That's according to Socratic ideas.
And change your idea. Yeah, if another idea is better, you have to then change the idea.
You have to bow to the stronger argument.
Yeah, but also though, I think the cancellers, as we've talked about in the past, I don't cancel myself. I think of myself as an old-fashioned liberal. You have a right to say things. I defend your right to say it, and so on. But the cancellers would say, I think that they are in a sense answering a dominant idea, which is everything can be said, and that we have a free flow of ideas, which itself is an ideological position, because it neutralizes the hurt that is done. It neutralizes, who knows, slavery may have been not too bad. Let's debate slavery. No, let's not debate slavery. Let's debate whether there was a Holocaust. No, let's not debate that. And so in some senses, there is a way in which you have to shut down the debate in order to, because the debate itself is not neutral.
That's a good point, John. Yeah.
But John, I don't know, because the problem with that is where do you go with that? At what point how far do you go with that? Because I think that, if you want to debate the Holocaust, or you want to debate, then it shouldn't be very difficult to show that if you're supporting slavery, it's a very bad idea. It's not a good idea, and that needs to be exposed continually.
That is an argument that I find quite persuasive. That anyone who stands up in a debate and decides to debate the virtues of slavery is probably going to get be exposed. And but someone might say, well, yes, but the fact that you're holding this debate is itself a ideological statement of possibility of that as a debatable thing. Well, there you go.
The fact that the German state made it illegal to wear any Nazi uniform and to deny the Holocaust. And that's quite right, there is a law there. Most people wouldn't consider that to be an aspect of cancel culture for all the reasons that John has just expressed. There are certain things which are too appalling to even open a discussion relating to, did the Holocaust ever occur, is deeply anti-Semitic. So you can understand why there are laws to stop those discussions taking place in Germany.
Yeah, completely. And I suspect that if me and you were in our youth, and once again, and it's in some student common room, there would be the debate would be actually quite an ethical and moral sort of debate. I hope it would be about harm which is done and rectifying harm of the past. So I think there is a debate going on about virtue, but in our society, generally speaking, the broader world, the young debate virtue, but the economists don't. I think that is the problem.
You are listening to a discussion by the Spinoza Triad. That's Dr. Richard Miller, Dan Rowland, and myself, John Gibbs. And in this episode, we are discussing Plato's Gorgias and the problem of persuasion.
The virtuous life is, and he makes a case for the idea that to do harm is harmful to you. And the example he gives is that if you were to, it would be better to suffer an injustice than do an injustice. It would be better to be put in prison for something you didn't do, rather than be put in prison. It would be worse to be put in prison for something you didn't do than be put into prison for something, than to get away with something that you did do. So if you had a choice between, going to prison for a crime you committed or getting off for the crime you committed, you should choose go to prison.
Yeah, he kind of thinks it's because you've got to think about your soul. So therefore, punishment offers the opportunity to clean your soul. And therefore, you actually make the wish that your enemies are not punished because their souls will be cleaned.
Yeah, and even if we reject... Yeah, absolutely. Because he has an idea of the soul. Beyond this world, there's another kind of world, the eternal soul and so on. But for us, you might say, well, I don't know about souls and stuff of that kind. I'm not a religious person. But the moral argument is quite a strong one. It's about being kind of morally true to yourself is more important than winning or than purely sort of instrumental success. You can lead a life of brutality and be very. This is the argument that's going to develop later on, isn't it? You can live a life of brutality, and Polus says, well, everyone wants to lead a life that is successful and powerful. So if you could persuade people to do things they didn't want to do, you'd have pleasure, and that's what life is for. And then Socrates is going to say, no, life isn't for pleasure. It is to be morally true to yourself. Is to adhere to some kind of sense of the good. Well, that's a difficult challenge to all of us, isn't it? In a sense, because he's asking us to reflect on what is it we're doing. What are we kind of for?
And if you think about in our modern world, I think that the modern world is with Polus, because it's even written into the US Constitution, the right to be happy, and hedonism is seen as the main moral ethic at the moment. You've got a duty to yourself to be happy. And so the way we perhaps see things now is so far removed from what Socrates through Plato is trying to get at. We don't talk like this anymore.
Yes. And it's going to foreshadow. It's going to, this is echoes later of this in Kant's categorical imperatives.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are morally right, not using others as an ends. All people can't be used. People are ends in themselves. They can't be used as a means to an end. Says Kant. That you must never lie. The truth above all things. Well, you can stick to that or not. But in other words, there isn't simply, as Polus and then Callicles even more so is going to say, who wouldn't acquire pleasure if you could live in the great big palace? So what is leading the good life? Well, essentially, it's being true to a set of quite stern moral, personal values.
So that's what Plato is saying.
That's what Plato is going to say.
Polus is saying the opposite, and then Callicles takes it even further, doesn't he?
Polus gets caught out because he says he wants to say it is pleasurable, and then Socrates points out that actually it's not. He uses the analogy of a leaky pot, and he says, if you seek pleasure, pleasure pours in it, but it always leaks out.
It's a good one, that.
You have one big dinner, you want another big dinner. You have one.
Yeah, but you can never get to the maximum level of pleasure. You always need more and more.
Yes. So whereas if you can find some sort of contemplative happiness, then your pot is full and doesn't leak.
But this is the main guiding principle we live by. The pleasure and experiences and the property and everything.
It's the hedonic treadmill, isn't it?
The pursuit of pleasure gets you nowhere. A lot of philosophy of that idea that ultimately, and indeed, and we might look around us and we said it ourselves. This mounting up of stuff, this consumer society, consuming for what purpose? That subsequent end. So then you come to Callicles, probably the most famous protagonist in ancient literature, really. I mean, this is the guy that's going to say something incredibly modern, such an extent that a lot of people say that in this dialogue, he doesn't go anywhere, this next discussion. He doesn't outfox Callicles, because you can't. You have literally met that person who tells you, I'm a racist and I don't care. What do you do with that? I don't think there is such a thing as... So Callicles' argument essentially is might is right. All morality is simply structured by the weak to persuade the strong that they should treat them better. That in the end, the law of nature, the law of the universe, is one purely of power.
Yeah.
He also describes philosophers, sorry for interrupting, as slaves amongst the free.
Well, yeah. So I mean, Callicles, it is an appealing argument in a way, because it says all of this is bourgeois nonsense. All you old men, what do you think about the world? In the end, this is the world. Old men talking to boys. That's all philosophers. He says that at some point. Old men are just philosophers. Old men talking to boys. What you want is men of action. This is Ayn Rand. So in a sense, in Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver goes to the island, the floating islands in the sky, which are inhabited entirely by philosophers, and in the philosophers are engaged on trying to squeeze the sunlight out of cucumbers. It's a satire on the wasted nonsense.
Squeeze the sunlight out of cucumbers. That's hilarious.
Oh, it's the man out life.
Have cucumbers, yeah, they spend hours trying to squeeze the sunlight out of cucumbers, and it's a well, yeah. So Callicles is going to say, get out your shed, Gibbs. Get out your shed. Get out into the world. Be a man of action. What is all this talking about stuff?
Yeah, misogynistic and just kind of, paternalistic and very masculine, isn't it?
Well, and it proposes a morality which exists today. I don't think it's far away from an awful lot of morality that is actually operated through history, which is might is right. The powerful justify themselves by their success.
It says nature's like this, so we're the same. Stop kidding ourselves.
It is. And Plato puts it to him. He says, look, in the end, the most powerful people harm themselves. And if he says, if you judge a virtue by harm, for instance, today we would look at someone like Putin. Putin, through years of struggle and bumping people off and hurling people off balconies and poisoning people abroad and terrifying people and locking them up, has become the top dog in a system of power. But can he ever close his eyes at night and not wonder if someone's going to come in and shoot him? Does he at 3 a.m? Does he not wake up and wonder whether in the future someone, when he falls from power, there's the investigation into where all the money went, and he ends his life in Siberia. There's no good outcome in a sense. So the unhappiest person
is the most powerful.
Just goes back to the argument he used for Polus, that it doesn't produce pleasure, it doesn't produce happiness, it harms you.
Because you're not thinking of your soul. That's kind of where Plato is going with this.
Well, yeah, it ends with that. It ends with a rather odd, kind of mystical bit where Socrates talks about the soul, and in the end, he just does a sort of idea of the soul after life and so on, which is less. Well, I think if we in modern terms, if we disregard the idea of the soul and these kind of slightly mystical elements, it's simply proposing an idea of how to lead the virtuous life.
I think today, would we say instead of soul, we'd say the self, and the self being fully satisfied. I think maybe today, in terms of psychology or psychiatry, would we say a self individualized individual. That's the closest we get to the idea of perhaps the soul in a modern sense, is that living a full life. That's kind of where we want to go, isn't it? Living fully and living in a fully satisfied way. So if we followed Callicles and just saying might is right, there's always going to be something missing.
It's true. And I guess that the inheritors of Callicles in a way are the kind of tech bro Muskites who think that they are supermen in a slightly Nietzschean term, the futurists who believe they're leading mankind to Mars, and quests of, and this idea. I know they're not using a might is right argument particularly, but they're certainly using an idea of the purpose of virtue is action and propelling us forward.
I mean, yeah, yes and no, John. I think that there's a kind of idea there as well. Like if you take Musk for an example, the idea of the idea of Mars living on. I think there's an idea there of a better human race, isn't there? An idea, whether or not it's one of those things. It's debatable. There's a debate.
John's right. I think these are the supermen we have today are not concerned with how to live. They're only concerned with solutions to problems. Okay, we've destroyed this planet. Let's go and find a new one. And then we'll probably do the same when we get there. It's not about improving the way you live your life. There's no moral vision to any of these solutions. They're just practical solutions that involve huge amounts of money and will probably be done. But they're not going to improve the way people live their lives or people's outlooks. So,
so if we say to ourselves, well, let's is the vision of the virtuous life something like finding inner contentment, finding the ataraxia, the kind of feeling of contentment with your life and so on, or is what the purpose of your brief span on this earth to be is to climb that mountain because it exists, to find that city within the jungle because you're an explorer, to push the boundaries, to go boldly where no man has gone before, and that is the sort of purpose of existence. Because we present quite oddly at schools and in education both of those visions to students. You must be the best you can be. On the other hand, you must also be a good person. But everything about our system is, in a sense, to dissatisfy you. That you will, if you go out into the world and you become a very happy seller of fruit, you'll have somehow sense of, within our culture, there'll be a sense of failure. Because you have limited, the people we admire are the ones who have been original, who have pushed the boundaries, invented something,
or who are very rich,
or we mistake that their enormous wealth somehow gives them those
makes them better people.
Isn't
there that word that Plato goes with pleonexia, sort of taking more than one share at the expense of others? We kind of, even though we like to consider ourselves to be ethical and moral, but we kind of put people like that on the pedestal.
We do, and you can see it manifested in one of the most extraordinary social changes of the last few decades. Is that in the 1970s, 80s, the super rich were like 10, 20 times richer than the average person, and now they're hundreds of times richer. It's been an absolute off the scale acceleration, and as a society, as a world, in a sense, we've seemed to have sort of shrugged our shoulders and said, well, fair enough. Some people can have astronomical wealth.
But that is, we do a certain, all the way from Victorian times, we've associated immorality with poverty and morality with wealth. So somehow people who are wealthy are seen as, you said earlier, John, are seen as better people.
No, that's true now, though, is it? Do you not think there's been there is a trend of reverse of that now?
I think it's not true now. But no, I don't think it's true now. I don't think we admonished, like we used to in the 19th century, that the homeless and the poor used to be brushed off the streets. They wouldn't be seen. But I still think we suffer from the problem of putting rich people on a pedestal, and also, as you say, in schools, where we kind of sell the idea that everyone can be wealthy and everyone can live exactly as they want to be, want to have, almost like a version of the American dream, rather than living well, I think, as That's what Plato is saying in the Gorgias. We don't talk about that in schools, how to live well. When that often means living within your means and not having more than other people.
Or in service of others, isn't there?
Or in service of others, yeah.
And the last challenge maybe we could end on is what Callicles says to Socrates. He says, look, he says, you think that what I'm saying is shameful. But he said, power and not to use power is more shameful. If a villain broke into your house and you had a gun but you refused to use it, you'd be shameful not to use it. If you have the potential for a power to do something and you don't use it. So it's using a kind of idea of that if you have capacities and an opportunity to exert power and you don't use it, then that is the shameful life.
Does Plato overcome this problem? I think
no, they end up
whether he does it. He ends up having to write the Republic, doesn't he?
It's one of the few dialogues where at the end Socrates just or Plato gives Socrates a lengthy kind of diatribe or a monologue of his own, in which he talks about himself as the only true politician because he, in a sense, because he doesn't seek power, and the only people who should be politicians are the people who don't seek power. It's kind of I wouldn't belong to a club unless they accept me. Yeah, to be in service of others. Therefore, he says I'm the only true politician. He then talks about the future. That he says if people like me, philosophers, Socrates, were put on trial, and of course everyone knows what actually really happened in real life. Is if I were ever put on trial, I'd stand before an audience of children, and I'd use philosophy, but my prosecutors would be cake makers, and the children would go with them. And he's making an argument in a sense there that about the dangers of persuasion in an audience in a world of children.
Comes full
circle. That brings us back probably fully to, we could end on this thought really, is that the Trumpian persuasive powers must be quite considerable. They don't work on me, but they do work on an awful lot of people. The idea then is that if Trump were to justify his run for the White House, it would be purely in the exercise of power.
Absolutely.
Well, every politician has got to confront, isn't it, the idea that they are they in this to do good, or are they in this
themselves
to exercise power?
Yes, I mean that argument at the end there with the status, if you like, of I mean, did he go on to write? How soon after this did he write Republic? Right, yeah.
Yeah, the Republic comes after this. I'm not sure how long. I've not looked at the timeline of writing it. I think these things are debated when they're written, but they know this was written. This is generally accepted. This was written early, and its tone and his references to Socrates being put to death by the kinds of people that Gorgias are. Gorgias is the kind of persuader that is going to persuade people to kill good people, like Socrates. And in the end, Socrates goes to his trial and says, "You can kill me, I don't mind." I will stick to my arguments. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to say to mine own self, I shall be true. And in that sense, this attack on those sophists and those persuaders. The most interesting thing, I think, is Callicles. He jumps out at you, and the fact that it's difficult for Socrates to answer him in a sense. Are you right, Dan? I think you're right. I think in the Republic, in others, he has to pick up this argument about the virtuous life and where virtue comes from, because it's a problem. It's a problem, and it's going to reappear all the way through our society and history about the individual who says, "I make my own morality."
Yeah, I feel okay about this. It's nothing for me.
The dialogues are great. It raises so many good points, doesn't it? We could have gone into more depth on any of these positions. The critiques of democracy and the masses, if you like. I mean, there's a podcast there in itself, isn't there? It's very interesting. Is it true that I'm sure I read this that Oxford and Cambridge, you got 2 votes up until the 1960s or 70s, was it? You did?
Absolutely, yeah. I think up until the early 50s.
I didn't know that.
Wow.
Oxford and Cambridge had 2 MPs. An MP for the university and an MP for the town. So if you were a student in Oxford, you voted for you did 2 votes.
So it's Plato's idea of the elite, the philosopher kings. Yeah.
And this was kind of an idea. Exactly. Where did that idea come from? It's because the students at Oxford and Cambridge were clever. It comes back to talks about the philosopher kings. We talked about also about whether or not people should have intelligence tests before they can vote, or you give people with college degrees 2 votes. If you gave people with college degrees 2 votes in the United States, Kamala Harris would be the president.
Spending way too much time with their cucumbers. That's the trouble. Piecing the sunlight out of cucumbers, that's gold.
Squeezing sunlight.
Right, yeah.
I'm going to have to go away and do that. I'm going to cool down the smoke of sunlight.
That's it. Yes, let's go squeeze some light.
I think we're done. Shall we return to our cucumber patch, gentlemen?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yes. Let's retreat.
And that brings to an end another episode of the Spinoza Triad, where Dr. Richard Miller, Dan Rowland, myself, John Gibbs, discuss philosophy and anything else that interests us. If you've enjoyed our discussion, we talked today about Plato's Gorgias. You can hear it again on Spotify and multiple other platforms. Thank you for listening.